welcome and thanks so much for joining us today for this webinar on floods and farming in Australia. My name is Georgia Webster. I'm the General Manager at Farmers for Climate Action. I'm joining you today from Castlemaine in Victoria. I am on Dja Dja Wurrung country, and on behalf of Farmers for Climate Action, I would like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and the traditional owners of the land our guests and speakers are joining us from, and pay our respects to elders past and present. Farmers for Climate Action is an active and growing movement where we represent these days more than 7,000 farmers across Australia. And we're a movement of producers, agricultural leaders and rural Australians, and we're working together to influence Australia to adopt strong climate policies. And we're doing this so that we can realise a prosperous and sustainable future full of opportunity for farmers and farming communities. Today, in particular, we're focusing on floods and farming and kicking off a conversation about this. We're expecting this La Nina throughout the summer. It's looking like we're having even more floods and extreme weather. So we've been invited along today two renowned climate scientists, Professor Mackey and Kevin Hennessy, who will talk us through the science linking climate and floods. We'll also hear from a farmer, Chloe Fox, about the impacts of flooding on her property and business. We were to have another farmer, Oscar Pearse, joining us. Oscar is, unfortunately, an apology. He's actually still just finishing harvest, which has been significantly delayed due to the wet conditions themselves. So, slightly ironically, can't join us due to the ongoing wet. We're hearing from a lot of our farmers just telling us about really serious impacts from climate-driven floods on their farms, persistent unseasonal rainfall. It's really what's prompted us today to kick off this conversation and this webinar. Many have also said they've noticed a bit of a lack of discussion on climate change in media reports and the public conversation around flooding. So we just wanted to bring that together. You know, we're hearing from, one farmer in New South Wales had 7 different flood events of various levels on their farm this year. We've heard about lost crops, huge disruptions to harvesting, as Oscar's found, paddocks too wet to use machinery on, getting bogged. We were hearing about animal welfare concerns due to increased, water and rain-related disease, intense mosquito situations, which, people might have read about or heard about, having impacts on newborn calves who can become quite lethargic and unwell. So there's this huge range of impacts of this unseasonal climate-driven flooding. And not to mention, I guess, huge damage to infrastructure. We've got washed out roads, farm tracks washed away, bogged and damaged machinery, fencing washed away. And it's also worth just remembering that only a couple of years ago, we saw 500,000 cattle lost in Queensland due to the huge flooding they experienced up there. And of course, all of this flooding comes just 2 years after the Black Summer fires, which we saw a significant loss of life, destruction of countless farms and farm businesses, which, families and communities worked decades to build. So, what we're here to do is learn a bit more about the drivers of these extreme weather events so that we can equip ourselves to better tell the story and advocate for strong climate policies that protect Australia's food supply and farming into the future. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, hearing from Brendan, Kevin and Chloe. We really invite you to contribute your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. Pop any questions you've got at any time throughout the webinar in that box, and we will have a dedicated chunk of time at the end to field those questions and invite our guests to respond to them. The chat separately will also be live throughout. If there's anything you want to comment on or just note, really welcome to do that through that mechanism. So thanks for your contributions as well as listening in, everyone. I will now throw to you, Professor Brendan Mackey. I'll do a quick introduction. I understand you're the director of the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University in Queensland, that you got a PhD from the Australian National University. Brendan was also a coordinating lead author for the 2022 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC 6th Assessment Report, from Working Group 2, looking at impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. And we're really grateful to have you here. We know that you, Professor Mackey, have authored over 300 academic publications in the field of environmental science and policy, including on climate change. So really welcome you to share with us your perspectives on this critical issue. And I know you've got a few slides that you're going to pop up. So I'll welcome you to kick off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Georgia. I'll just share my screen and begin. And really, this is a joint presentation on the science of. I'm going to present the first half of it for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Kevin, who's going to do the second half of it. So, Georgia, is that working?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. So we're going to talk about the science of how climate change is making floods worse. That photograph is one of the consequences of the floods in northern rivers back in February. That's the road between Goonangarry and Federal. And again, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that I'm talking to you from. I'm at a conference in Wollongong today, so that's the Dharawal people, and pay respect to their elders. Here are the main points that we're presenting today, where, if you like, these are the main take-home messages. Increasing greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuel and deforestation degradation is causing rapid climate change. A warmer world is actually a wetter world overall, but not uniformly. So it also means more extreme droughts in some places and more extreme rainfall in others. What we call colloquially rainfall on steroids is resulting in an increase in floods globally and in Australia. And climate change is doing this by influencing the four main systems that drive Australia's rainfall extremes, including the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO, but others as well. And unfortunately, extreme rain and flooding will continue to get worse for decades to come, as we have at least another 0.4 degree of global warming locked in. And I also just want to clarify that we don't have time to talk about the following relevant matters, which hopefully I'd like to make the focus of a follow-up webinar to this one. So we're not talking about how flood risk is affected by the interactions of extreme rain hazards together with the exposure and vulnerability of human and natural systems. So we're not actually looking at the impacts of the increased flood risk, just the science of how climate change is driving those events. And we're also not talking today about what we can do to reduce flood risk for the farming sector, the kind of adaptations that people are taking and could be taking. And nor are we talking about the implications of these worsening floods for disaster resilience planning, but we're very happy to come back at a later date to talk about them. I also want to say something about this scientific index we call global warming. We talk about this all the time, and all our governments, including the current government, have agreed to try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That doesn't sound like much to people, but the way to understand this is it's really like an index, like a thermometer reading of Earth's health. So for a human, a safe average body temperature is about 36, 37 degrees. 38 degrees is diagnostic of a fever, and above 40 is life-threatening. Well, for the planet, a healthy Earth temperature is 0 degrees above pre-industrial. 1.1 degree is equivalent of a planetary fever, and above 1.5 degree we can think of as life-threatening. So when we use these numbers, just try and keep that kind of comparison in mind. So it's now an established scientific fact that humans are driving climate change due to the greenhouse gases building up in the atmosphere for the use of fossil fuel for energy. And we're using that energy in everything we do: manufacturing, transportation, heating and cooling buildings, and agriculture, and also the emissions from deforestation and degradation. And as of a couple of years ago, or say now, we're currently 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And if you think of my previous slide, that's a very serious degree of global warming. And we have another 0.4 degree locked in, and that's likely to be reached by around 2030, but certainly within 10 years. Unfortunately, current global policies for mitigating greenhouse gases, like what all the governments are currently implementing would result in global warming of about 3.2 degrees. With the enhanced ambition we heard at the recent climate COP, that's reduced to about maybe 2.5 degrees, but it's still well above what we consider, well above the current level. And limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees requires deep, rapid and sustained cuts in emissions. And the thing to keep in mind then that every increment of global warming, every 0.1 represents a massive amount of change in the Earth's climate system. Another fact is there's a warmer world, because we know the planet's warming, is actually a wetter world overall, and that's because a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor than a colder atmosphere, and an atmosphere with more water vapor can make more rain. That's why it's wetter at the tropics, where the atmosphere is hot, than it is at the North and South Pole, where the atmosphere is cold. It just can't hold much precipitable moisture. So very roughly, you get about a 7% increase in the amount of water vapor held by the atmosphere per degree of global warming. But, and this is really the key point, not everywhere gets wetter. What is happening with climate change is that the patterns of rainfall are changing. So it's quite different to temperature. With temperature, everywhere is getting hotter all the time. But with rainfall, the patterns of rainfall are changing. So how is climate change altering rainfall? Well, the location, the amount, the intensity, the seasonality, and the frequency of rainfall is changing in most parts of the world. We've got some examples there. Over the last 100 years, we've had actually increases in rainfall in Eastern North America, Northern Eurasia, Southern South America, and Northwest Australia, and really significant decreases across tropical, Western and equatorial Africa and Southern Asia. So different places are experiencing different altered rainfall. And climate change has contributed to strengthening the contrast between the wet tropics and the dry subtropics, as well as high latitude increases and mid-latitude decreases in Southern Hemisphere summer precipitation since the 1970s. And of course, that decrease in Southern Hemisphere summer precipitation and is relevant to Australia. The other observed fact now from the 1.1 degrees of climate change we're currently experiencing. So keep that in mind. We're not talking about future climate change. We are now living the consequences of 1.1 degree of global warming. Extreme rainfall events are getting worse. So global warming has increased both the intensity and frequency of extreme precipitation events. And that's an example we've all heard about. Pakistan experienced abnormal monsoonal rainfall nearly 3 times higher than the past 30-year average, affecting more than 33 million people. And further global warming will lead to more intense precipitation events. So even if you're in a location that doesn't get more rain, you might get the same amount of rain, but in more intense precipitation events. So what is happening in Australia? Well, again, we're reflecting at our regional level, national level, what's happening globally. So, and the way we describe this, we say ongoing climate trends have exacerbated extreme events, including floods. So what do we mean by that? Well, by climate trends, we mean observed temperature changes. As I've been saying, everywhere is getting warmer. Some places are just getting warmer more than others. Australia, and that shows the graph on the right, the graph on the left shows the mean annual temperature for Australia, the whole Australian continent. So we take the annual average temperature from everywhere in Australia and average it out for the continent. And you can see, and that's comparing it to 1990, you can see things really started to take off in the 1970s, and where the Australian continent is now it's about 1.4 degrees. It's more than the global average, 1.4 degrees above what it was in 1900. New Zealand follows a similar track, but it's just a little bit cooler, being a lot more southern. We, of course, have a third of our continent in the tropics. So that's what we mean by a climate trend. It is if you like, an inexorable, continuous increase, in this case, in temperature, the average daily temperature for the continent. Another climate trend is sea level rise. As the atmosphere heats, it heats the ocean, and as water heats, it expands. And so the sea level is rising. It's very slowly, but it's continuous, and it will continue to happen. It's a trend. So what we're finding is this increase in global temperature and in Australia's temperature is exacerbating, in fact, all extreme events that Australia experiences. Heat waves, bushfires, droughts and floods. These are all getting either more frequent or more intense or of longer duration as these climate trends continue. So if you go back to the year 2002, we had 0.6 degree of global warming, and in 2022 it's 1.1 degrees. That's about an increase of 0.5 global warming over 20 years. And I just told you we're going to see another 0.4, about the same amount, happen in the next 8 to 10 years. So we're going to see as much climate change in the next 8 to 10 years as what we saw in the last 20 years. So just think about how much worse the heat waves have got, the bushfires have got, the droughts have got, and the floods have got. Well, we're going to see continuing worsening, in the next decade. And certainly the data is in now about floods. So in Australia, when it comes to floods, there's two kinds of floods. There's pluvial floods and fluvial. Fluvial floods is river flooding, river floodplains. Pluvial is, we would normally think of that as flash flooding. So it's not a river rising and spreading out along a floodplain. It's the flash flooding that causes landslides and landslips and the like. So here's some observed changes in Australia from our records. Extreme hourly rainfall intensities increased by 10 to 20% in many locations between the 60s and the first decade of this century. Daily rainfall records associated with thunderstorms increased 13 to 24% over a similar time period, particularly in Northern Australia. And these are having huge impacts. Pluvial and fluvial flooding are the most dangerous natural disasters in Australia, averaging 8.8 billion a year. The 2019 floods in northern Queensland cost $5.68 billion. And that was on top of the floods of 2011, which were 6.9 billion worth of costs. So we know that that the intensity of big rainfall events is increased, has increased, and will continue to increase, and this will drive further pluvial and fluvial flooding. And that picture I showed you on my very first slide of that road, in fact, it was a whole hillside collapsing away in northern rivers. It's an example of pluvial flooding impacts. So I've talked in very general terms about how the greenhouse gas emissions are increasing global temperature, how this rise in that climate trend is impacting on rainfall everywhere in the world. Some places are getting more rain, some are getting less. That's true in Australia as well. And it's also increasing the frequency and or duration and or intensity of extreme weather events, including intense rainfall events, and how that drives an increase in pluvial and fluvial flooding. But I want to hand over to Kevin now, who's going to talk about more of the mechanics of how that's actually happening. So to kind of go from the global scale and kind of continental overview to what are the actual weather and climate processes that are being affected that are bringing us the changes that we're experiencing, and how might they change in the coming decades. So Kevin, I'll stop there and hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Brendan. And just by way of introduction, I'm a climate scientist and knowledge broker. I worked for CSIRO for 30 years, and for the last 5 years, I've been a private consultant. And I've been involved in the IPCC for about 20 years, including the most recent report on Australasia, along with Brendan. So next slide, thank you, Brendan. So to give you an understanding of the context of Australian floods, we need to consider where the rain comes from. And the schematic diagram on the left there is quite busy, and that's because there are so many different factors affecting our rainfall. So Brendan, if we just go back to the previous slide. So we've got things like cold fronts in the south and cut off low pressure systems, east coast lows. We've got tropical depressions and of course tropical cyclones and northwest cloud bands, which bring a lot of rain across the country. But the main driving factors are threefold. So the first is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. Now that's based in the Pacific, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that soon, but essentially it's related to sea surface temperature and pressure anomalies in the tropical Pacific Ocean. When we have a La Nina, as we are now, Australia becomes cooler and wetter than normal, whereas an El Nino makes Australia hotter and drier than normal. The second large-scale driving factor is the Indian Ocean Dipole, and as the name suggests, it's centered in the Indian Ocean and related to anomalies of sea surface temperatures and atmospheric pressure. And a positive Indian Ocean Dipole event can lead to below average rainfall in winter and spring over central and southern Australia, whereas a negative Indian Ocean Dipole has the opposite effect. And we're having a negative Indian Ocean Dipole as we speak. So positive Indian Ocean Dipole events are more likely during El Nino events, and negative Indian Ocean Dipole events are more likely during La Nina events, which is currently occurring. So that's exacerbating the standard effect of La Nina. And then finally, the southern annular mode. This is centered in the Southern Ocean, so to the south of Australia. And again, that's related to anomalies of both sea surface temperatures and wind patterns. So a positive phase causes a southward shift of the westerly winds, which increases rainfall in eastern Australia with more east coast lows, but it gives less rainfall to the rest of southern Australia. And you get the opposite of that during a negative phase. And we are currently in a positive phase of the southern annular mode. So we've got a triple whammy happening. In addition to the fact that we've had 3 consecutive La Ninas, the one that we're in now also is being exacerbated by a positive southern annular mode and a negative Indian Ocean Dipole. And all of this, as Brendan said, is being supercharged by climate change. Next slide, please, Brendan. Now, just last week, the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO released the State of the Climate report for 2022. And it had some really interesting information about rainfall trends. And so the graphs we have here from the left is rainfall in southwestern Australia, just for the months of April to October. The middle graph is again April to October rainfall, but it's for southeastern Australia. And on the right, we've got rainfall from October to April, so the summer half of the year, for northern Australia. So the first thing to see about the southwest of WA is a very sustained decrease. It's about a 15% decline since the 1970s. Lots of wiggles and bumps from year to year, but a very sustained decline, and that's had major impacts on water resources and agriculture. In the middle graph, we see that there's been about a 10% decrease in rainfall in the southeast since the late 1990s. And in both cases, these changes have been partly attributed to climate change, which has pushed the weather systems further south. And then finally, in the north, we've seen wetter conditions, particularly since the 1970s, but the causes of these changes are uncertain. Some work suggests that it might be due to an increase in aerosol pollution over Asia, which is affecting the monsoon. But it does not rule out climate change as well due to increases in greenhouse gases. And further research is needed there. Next slide, please, Brendan. So let's look at what's also happening with El Nino and La Nina and a few other factors. So some research that was published about 10 years ago indicates that both La Ninas and El Ninos may become more extreme with further global warming. So that has implications for both floods and droughts. So with La Ninas, the floods might become more intense. With El Ninos, the droughts might become more intense. And in fact, we've seen over the past 50 years that the level of El Nino and La Nina activity is higher, with more significant El Nino and La Nina events since the 1970s. We've also seen changes in ocean and atmospheric circulation patterns, including a weakening of the equator to pole temperature gradient. And this is because the polar regions are warming faster as the ice is melting. And that's led to an expansion of the tropics, or the Hadley cell as we call it. And that has implications for where the rain, of course, is falling. And we've also had a trend toward a more positive phase of the southern annular mode since the 1950s, especially in summer. And all of these factors have contributed to the increase in average rainfall we've seen in the north and the decrease in average rainfall we've seen in the south and the east. And those diagrams just to the left there are just showing that in an El Nino on the top, we have higher than or warmer than normal ocean temperatures in the eastern tropical Pacific, and that leads to increased convection and rainfall over the central Pacific, but less rainfall over Australia. Whereas the opposite thing happens with La Nina. We have colder than usual temperatures in the ocean over the eastern equatorial tropics. And that tends to also be associated with higher than normal temperatures near Australia, and that leads to more rainfall. Next slide, please, Brendan. This is just a brief animation of what La Nina looks like. Essentially, we've got this circulation pattern set up over the tropical Pacific, which tends to shift the center of convection and rainfall activity over Australia, as opposed to being over the central Pacific. We also have neutral conditions from year to year, but just focusing on the La Nina because we're talking about floods. So we've got this anomalous wind regime, and that sets up higher rainfall over Australia. Next one, please, Brendan. There's also been a bit of talk in scientific literature and in the media about atmospheric rivers and the association with floods. These rivers are like highways of water up in the atmosphere, and that's responsible for about 90% of the water vapor moving from north to south, and that covers about 10% of the planet. And when these atmospheric rivers with very high moisture content crash into mountain ranges, or they interact with cold fronts or coastal systems, the water rapidly drops out, and that can lead to potentially disastrous impacts. And an example of that was the floods in both southern Queensland and northern New South Wales in February and March of this year. And there's a really interesting link to an article in the conversation, which is worth following up. Next slide, please, Brendan. So that's what's happening now. What do we expect in future? Next, please. So this is similar to a diagram that Brendan showed before, which is just highlighting the fact that global warming depends on the greenhouse gas emission scenario. So for low emissions, shown in the green curve here, we expect a slower rate of global warming. And the vertical axis here is the global warming relative to pre-industrial times, around 1850 to 1900. So we've seen about one degree of global warming. Even for low emissions, we're going to exceed about 1.5 degrees of global warming. Whereas for high emissions, shown in red, it's a much faster rate of global warming, as you might expect, exceeding about 2 degrees of global warming by around 2040, exceeding 3 degrees around 2060, and exceeding 4 degrees potentially around 2080. And that's a worst case scenario. The blue line, which is our intermediate scenarios, is roughly what we would follow if we implemented the emission reduction commitments to which most countries have agreed. Now, whether they do follow through with those commitments remains to be seen, but that means that we are looking at around about a 2.5 degree global warming by the end of the century. Next, please, Brendan. Now, with regard to changes in daily rainfall extremes, these are some busy graphs, so I'll just orient you. We've got 4 regions: the east, the north, rangelands, and southern Australia. The vertical axis on all of these graphs is a percentage change in rainfall by the end of the century, so 2080 to 2099, relative to 1986 to 2005. And the blue bars are for an intermediate emission scenario, which we're sort of tracking, and the red or purple bars are for a very high emission scenario. And if we just focus on Eastern Australia to start with, we've got here projections of annual mean rainfall change by the end of the century in the first few bars. And here we're looking at about a 10% decrease in annual average rainfall. But interestingly, with the next set of bars in the middle, the annual maximum daily rainfall is likely to increase by about 5 to 15%, depending on the emission scenario. So even in an area where the average rainfall goes down, the extreme daily rainfall can go up. And then the final 2 bars in that Eastern Australian plot show the 1 in 20 year extreme rainfall, and that could increase by roughly 15 to 25%. So the more extreme the rainfall, the higher the percentage increase is likely to occur. It's a similar story in most of the other regions, but interesting to note that in Northern Australia, the annual average rainfall is roughly 0 change, with a wide range of uncertainty. The annual maximum one-day rainfall goes up roughly 10 to 20%, and the 1 in 20 year event goes up around about 10 to 25%. So you can see that there's an exacerbation of the change in extreme rainfall as you go to more rarer events. Next slide, please, Brendan. And just to conclude, there's some work done by a company called Climate Risk, which looked at flood risk hotspots both now and by the end of the century. And so on the left table, we've got the 2020 ranks from 1 to 10, and on the right, we've got the same for the year 2100. So just focusing on the current situation, the worst or the highest risk area was judged to be Greater Shepparton. There's 2 columns there. TTP IP is the annual average damage cost, and the other one, the VAR percent, is the percent change of the value potentially at risk. And so we can see as we go down, Gold Coast is the second in line, Brisbane, Wangaratta, Port Phillip, and so on. And it's interesting that most of those areas have been affected in the recent floods this year and last year. There are some missing, so around Echuca and that sort of area on the Murray isn't listed there, but clearly it is at risk. And then as we go into the future, most of the rankings are very similar. There's a little bit of switching around. The Sunshine Coast seems to drop down, and the central coast of New South Wales seems to come up. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. It's very early work, and there's a number of other factors that probably should be considered, but that just gives you a taste of where the greatest risk lies both now and in the future. And with that, I'll stop and hand over to Chloe.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Brendan. Fascinating and sobering information. I really appreciate that. I'll just briefly welcome and introduce Chloe and thank her for joining us. Chloe Fox is a farmer, a producer who farms at Somerset Farm, which is leased land within a vineyard property in Seymour in north central Victoria. The farm is, which we'll hear lots more about from you, Chloe, situated on a bend on the riverbanks of the Goulburn River. Also home to a lot of diversity in terms of native animals and insects. She and her team grow veggies, the focus on heirloom and heritage varieties, And what we're going to hear about is the event on the 13th of October where the Goulburn broke its banks and inundated the farm. And as I understand, we'll hear from you, Chloe, about how the farm remained under a significant amount of water for a number of days. So we really appreciate your time today, sharing with us what that impact has been and how it's gone for you. So I'll pass to you, Chloe. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name's Chloe Fox. I am lucky enough to farm on Tongarong land in Seymour. We're right on the edge of town, on, as Georgia said, a bend in the river. So we've got the Goulburn River on 3 sides of the farm, and a normally dry gully on the other side of the farm. We've got 4 acres of mixed vegetable production. We farm organically in practice. We're within a small vineyard property, and we have fantastic soil, and we're lucky enough to access water from the Goulburn River, normally, luckily. It's an amazing spot to grow vegetables. They're incredibly proud of what we're able to produce here. We would grow hundreds of different crop varieties over the year. We focus on seasonality. As Georgia said, we grow heirloom and heritage varieties. So we do that for a number of reasons. It's because we grow for flavour, we grow for taste, we grow vegetables you're excited to eat. And also they're more heirloom and heritage varieties of vegetable are more adaptable to different climatic conditions. They're more they're more resilient, and that's why we grow them. So we normally supply to restaurants in Melbourne. We also sell at farmers markets and supply to our local community. 4 acres doesn't sound like a lot in the scale of larger farming, but in terms of a vegetable garden, we do produce a lot of food. So in terms of what the farm looks like, we have a road that runs into the farm through that dry gully. We have fences on all sides, or we did have fences, and we've got quite a bit of farming infrastructure. We have a tractor, we've got cold rooms, we've got pack sheds. We did have a polytunnel, so an undercover hoop house sort of thing where we grow over winter. Greenhouses. Lots of infrastructure, lots of irrigation set up. So on the 12th of October, we've had a really wet winter here. So it's been quite a challenging season all around. So a really wet winter. It was pouring rain on the Wednesday, the 12th. We were warned of a minor flooding event. In terms of what that would mean, it would mean some water into the gully, which would be the first time. I've been here for 7 years. It would be the first time I've seen water in that dry gully. The minor flooding event very, very quickly became more than minor. We woke up in the morning, the gully flooded early, before about 8 o'clock in the morning. Water started creeping onto the farm by mid-morning. So we were sort of heading to what we call moderate flood level. If it had have stayed at that, we would have seen some crop damage, but nothing extreme. We would have recovered quite quickly. We wouldn't have had any major losses and no infrastructure losses. As the day went on, the river broke on the far side of the farm, and started creeping in that way. By about midday, the river broke its banks on the other side, and that's when we really started to see the full extent of the Goulburn River. Our farm became a part of the river. The full flow of water through the farm, it was intense. It was still pouring rain, and we had water just absolutely pouring through. Our only access to the farm was via kayak, and by mid-afternoon it was too dangerous for us to even be over there. Yeah, the water got to the high water mark is above my head on the farm. The water remained for 5 days, and our only option was to kayak around and look at the damage and just to see maybe the tops of some crops peeking out. But yeah, it was like being in a lake. You wouldn't have realized there was a farm underneath there. All of our fences were severely damaged and either need to be replaced or repaired. Our huge shipping container cold room was picked up and moved about 2 meters, which looks like that's unfathomable. Like, look at the size of it. All of our irrigation was severely damaged. Our buildings were damaged. Our polytunnel was completely destroyed beyond recognition. We lost all of our crops. So tens of thousands of seedlings or established plants. Our entire garlic crop. So just the value of the garlic crop alone was up to $100,000 just in garlic alone. Yeah, it's really wiped out our entire season. And 7 weeks later, like today is 7 weeks since the flood, and we are just starting to replant this week. Yeah, we've only actually dipped to officially not being in a flood in the past 2 weeks. I think it was a week and a half ago that we dropped below minor flood level again. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah,
Thanks, Chloe.
we're back to pretty much a clean slate for the farm. I'd like to sort of we do have insurance as a farm, but you can't insure farms for flood. It's just not an option. As farmers, we're used to being adaptable. We know how we're used to extreme weather, but you can't adapt to this sort of extreme event. Food production, by the nature of the very nature of food production, we need to farm in areas with access to water and good soil, and farms are always they're going to be in areas that are going to be affected by extreme climate events. Food production is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and like they said, we're already living in this reality. If we don't start to take action, food production is going to be more and more affected by this. And for anyone who likes to eat, yeah, it's precarious at the best of times. So yeah, unless we address it, we'll have to be. It's actually really hard to look at those photos sometimes. We were left with there's no way to flood proof a farm. This is a something we need to address as a society and as a
This is tough stuff, Chloe, and yeah, we really, really appreciate you sharing and reliving it. And yeah, it's a massive impact, and we're really sorry. And there's a few folks echoing that in the Q&A box. So thank you everyone for your messages, people expressing their sorrow for what you folks have been through, Chloe. There is one question that I will pick up on though, just to follow on from your presentation. Do you have any idea of your total financial loss, what that future looks like in terms of protecting your livelihood, and how you might plan around this insurance question? Or is it still something you're working through?
It's definitely something we're working through. I haven't quantified it in total numbers of our loss. Um, there's almost no point. I can evaluate like the loss from individual crops, but it's too heartbreaking to actually work out the full total. In terms of recovery, we'll be back in production sometime in January or February, but we've lost the like 4 to 5 months of vegetable production. And it's going to take us a long time to be growing at the capacity that we were. In terms of like addressing it for future, we know what to do in terms of we will build back to be as resilient as possible. But there's only so much we can do. We can't stop the Goulburn River when it decides to flood through our farm. And we're like, normally we're incredibly lucky to farm here, but, and our access to good soil and water is incredibly important to food production. It's not a case of packing up and moving to somewhere you'll never be flooded, because honestly, this is where food production happens. Farming happens in areas that, yeah, are incredibly sensitive to climate change.
And one further question from one of our audience members today is just, Chloe, are you getting enough support? And if so, who is being the most helpful?
We've had incredible support from far and wide, from our local community, from individuals reaching out. We've had different levels of support through government. I know there is some funding available, like we're applying for all the grants through rural finance and things like that. In terms of money, I think we'll fall short of reaching the amount that we actually need to recover. There is no like, and that's before we even start talking about lost income. In terms of just replacing all of our infrastructure and our seedlings and plants, and yeah, just everything. In terms of financial support, I don't think we'll get anywhere near what we need to. We're incredibly grateful for the support we have received, and our community really has come together to, like, we've had working bees, we've had people from different government agencies reach out. But yeah, a lot of this is going to be just, it's a massive financial loss, right?
And just on the insurance, just to expand on that a bit further, in your view, what can be done about the fact that farmers can't insure a farm for flood? Is there anything that you could see that could or should change there?
Oh, look, I'd love to see farms be insured for flood. I'd love to see insurance. Look, even just looking at our local community, the bulk of people that were flooded are uninsured for flood, whether that's homeowners or farms or sorry, I'm just going to move away from that dog. Flood insurance is like, the more stories you hear, you realize that almost nobody is covered for flood, and insurance. We pay incredibly high premiums for our insurance already every year. But that doesn't look. I'd love to see a bigger solution. I don't have the answers to that. I don't know how you would get the insurance. It's an incredible risk for the insurance industry to cover an event like this that would cost them a lot of money. And the scale of this sort of event, it's into the billions. I don't know what we will possibly do to protect ourselves in future. In terms of money, it's like, farming is a risky venture, but this does seem extreme.
Yeah. Another question just for the Q&A while I've got you, Chloe. So I've got a couple of others for you, Kevin and Brendan. How much do you produce in a normal year?
Well, in terms of money, we turn over about 600 grand. And we employ between 5 and 10 people over the year. In terms of vegetable production, that's we grow so many different crops. So yeah, more than 100 different crop varieties over the year. It's a lot of food. We supply 40 restaurants across Melbourne. We do at least one farmers market every weekend. We supply into the local community and various food hubs. Yeah, there is no per ton weight that would make any sense in terms of vegetable production for us. But it's a lot of food. We also grow, like, I'm wary of sounding like we're a bougie farm that sort of just produces fancy vegetables for fancy restaurants. We grow a big diversity of vegetables, and supplying restaurants allows us to make those vegetables available to a broader community, and we're able to get vegetables to people that you wouldn't be able to get in a normal supermarket, or yeah, you wouldn't normally get to eat. Yeah, diversity of diets is really important. We're really proud to make those vegetables available to people.
And there's a couple of questions that have come through around your soil. So can you tell us a bit about how your soil has fared? Have you lost soil? Have you gained soil? Has there been contamination issues? And just a quick overview of the soil situation would be great.
Yeah. So we're in the process of testing at the moment to really see if we have any contaminant issues in terms of what has been brought in by the river. We're waiting on those results. We're hopeful, like the initial indications are relatively good, but yeah, there's definitely a risk. All of the vegetables that were in the ground at the time, they're unsafe to eat. E. coli is a huge issue, so we had to sort of slash everything and start again. Yeah, there's a lot of testing that goes into it. We will be working on soil remediation for, like, soil is something you're constantly working on. We did have a lot of it washed away. So we will be working on that and building soil to recover from this event. Yeah, it's not an overnight thing that we can, and we'll definitely encounter, realizing that it's not just a flood and it's done. We're going to keep encountering issues as a result of this flood. The full scale of what we've experienced is still unfolding.
There's a question that came through about whether a more accurate flood warning might have made a difference to you, Chloe, and maybe I'll invite you, Brendan or Kevin, to speak on that. Is there anything that you might say or comment in terms of the way that these types of events are rolling out, their increasing extremity, and what our flood warning system might need in order to protect farmers and communities better?
For us, it would have made some difference. We were, completely, I won't say unprepared, but we weren't expecting the level of flood we could do. Like, it is an incredible flood, and we could have only prepared to a certain extent, maybe getting some more machinery out, but you can't move an entire farm. And for us, almost our entire region, kilometers in either direction, was flooded. So where do we even go in terms of that? I know, like, we're right beside some cattle farmers and things as well. So I know for a lot of livestock owners, and that, like, more warning would be helpful. A more accurate prediction.
Brendan or Kevin, if there's anything you'd like to add on that, I welcome you to. Otherwise, a few more questions coming through. All right, Kevin, there was a question I'll throw to you just about your overview.
Sorry, I was going to answer, Georgia, but
please go.
Yeah,
please.
So again, Chloe, thanks for sharing your story with it. It is really it's actually really useful to get that firsthand, eyewitness account of the impact of a flood of an event of such magnitude. So thanks for doing that. I really appreciate it. And rainfall's a difficult thing to predict, right? Because it's so variable in space and time, and generally, and in particular, intense rainfall events where these big storm cells are going to drop and when. So it's not like, the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO, are certainly working intensely on trying to improve the accuracy. It does come down in part to, a massive increase in investment in the kind of monitoring equipment needed for both being able to detect these things in real time and have all this sensor data plugged into the modelling, etc. So it's difficult because of the inherent randomness, if you like, and unpredictability about these extreme rainfall events. It's going to require a lot more instrumentation, both in terms of rainfall and flood levels, etc. And having systems that can feed all of that, into the models in real time. And I know people are working hard on it, but I think it's going to be some time before the science and the data are there to have the kind of real-time early warning that's needed for these kind of mega events.
Thank you. There was a question that I saw for you, Kevin, around the El Nino. You talked a bit about how that potentially that in future there'll be more, intense droughts in an El Nino phase. Is there anything you could say there about other particular areas of Australia that might be more affected by that? Is there any degree of detail that you can share a little bit more about that kind of phase?
Yeah, typically El Niños affect southern and eastern Australia. It can also affect the frequency of tropical cyclones, so that has an impact on northern Australia. But it affects Australia in two ways. So firstly, in terms of rainfall, so we would expect less rainfall, but also warmer conditions, and in particular, the really hot days that have an impact not only on human health, but also on livestock health and on crop productivity. So those two things, hotter and drier conditions, work together to exacerbate the impacts of droughts. And we expect, of course, with global warming, hotter conditions than now and even drier conditions than now. So the droughts will be more impactful, which is, it's an unfortunate situation. And of course, as we saw in 2019 and early 2020, we had the Black Saturday or the Black Summer fires. So we would also expect an increase in fire frequency and fire intensity in a hotter and drier climate.
Thank you. It was really powerful to hear about all those factors and that triple whammy, and then the exacerbation from global warming. I found that.
Sorry, can I just jump in to say, and this is why it really is so important that we do all we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? So, of course, the more we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, right, then the less we're going to see an exacerbation of these extreme events. The more, if you like, manageable our responses can be, right? The less costly the adaptations. So these things are all connected. Our strengthening our mitigation commitments and action, will make a difference to the climate, will help reduce extremes or help cap how they're exacerbated, and that'll make a huge difference, a real difference for farmers.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan, for summarising the nub of the issue there really, really well. One quick addition, Kevin. Sorry, I'm jumping around, but there's some really great questions coming through. You talked about that El Nino, and I will wrap up soon too. I'm conscious of everyone's time, but how are the flood of, the ongoing flood effects that we might see potentially affected by droughts preceding them? Like, is there any interaction between those events?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask Chloe how she was coping after going through a drought in 2019-20, just to be hit by floods, because it affects your resilience. There were so many people who were struggling to recover from the droughts and the fires and the heat waves in 2019-2020, only to be hit by, in some cases, a hailstorm in January of 2020, and then the floods following that. So it does affect your ability to bounce back, not only financially, economically, but also just mentally. It's incredibly draining, and so I reckon, unfortunately, that's the sort of the academic side of it. But I'd love to hear from Chloe about how you've coped after those two hits.
Yeah. So yeah, it has been an incredibly challenging few years. Our ability to bounce back, like, yeah, the extreme heat we've been having, these hot, dry summers, with long stretches of days over 40 degrees where it's just simply not safe to even be working outside, but beyond a certain time. I certainly wouldn't let any of my my farm staff work outside during the extreme heat of January. Vegetables really struggle. We're resilient and we're adaptable to a point, and we're doing what we do because we love it so much. And it's incredibly important. Like, we need people to grow food. That being said, there's only so far that you can be pushed. If it, yeah, like, we'll keep going and we'll keep trying. But I know this would be breaking point for a lot of people, and there is no certainty for us going into the future. Like, it's going to be more and more precarious. Like, we're definitely going to need, I don't know, like, there'll be other issues that come up. There'll be more challenges. I think as a farmer, you expect them. There is no certainty in growing. There's no certainty in farming. Just when you think you've got one thing figured out, a host of other things will crop up, and that can be part of the challenge and the good thing of farming, but can also make it really difficult. In terms of financial resiliency, it's getting battered year after year.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
And it is tough stuff. And I will note, this is really hard stuff. And there are resources for anyone who's, and folks in the audience there, if you're finding this tricky, there are a lot of resources, whether they're your local state government resources. I know New South Wales and Victoria, and I think Tasmania have had extra resourcing in those government areas just for mental health support, resilience support for communities. There's organisations like Rural Aid who are out there supplying material support, as well as counselling and wellbeing support to farmers and farming communities. It's a real thing, isn't it? So anyone out there who needs those, please do reach out, and we hope that you've got good support networks around you. It's tough stuff.
Can I just jump in for one little
second? Please.
So I'd really like to make it clear that, like, this is happening as part of climate change. These events are, like, they're more than just the weather. This is climate change in action. These events are going to continue happening. We need action on it. We want to be represented by people who are committed to action on climate change. We want to be part of the solution. I think we as farmers, we can be often misrepresented by politicians or the media as having different priorities than we actually do. We really care about seeing a future in which climate change is addressed, and we can keep on producing food for you all.
Very well said. And just noting the time, I'm really conscious of your time, folks, and those in our audience. So I will close here. I will note that we've had a number of questions. I'm sorry, folks, we didn't get to them all. Fantastic questions on shows the breadth of issues that floods and persistent rainfall events are having across pests, supply chains and infrastructure. I know like massive washed out road issues in your area, Chloe, and many others across the eastern seaboard. Hospo, food industry, and of course consumer end effects of all these supply chain disruptions, biodiversity impacts. There's a huge breadth, as well as, you know, financial and impacts across communities and individuals who are still in cleanup mode in many parts of the country. So thank you so much to everyone for your really considered questions. There was a lot of solidarity expressed in the questions too for Chloe and for other farmers facing such significant impacts. Is there any final comments I should note from any of you on our guest panel today that you might wish to just add before we close?
Yeah, I would just like to say, I think Chloe made a really important point when she said that, you know, where we grow food is highly exposed to these extremes. Because in her case, you need good soil and you need access to water, and that means that where your farm is placed, you know, is highly exposed, and that's a huge issue for Australian society, right? So this is why we really need governmental responses at all levels of government, you know, to be factoring this in to their adaptation and resilience planning. The fact that we have a sector which is really critical to the Australian economy and to the health and well-being of Australian people, who's highly exposed to these impacts, extreme events. So we do need policy that provides the support that they need. We do need to rethink about insurance and related matters. So, you know, there's important conversations to be had here on these issues.
I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. I think you said that very well, Brendan. I'll leave it to you, Chloe, to provide any closing comments.
Look, I think we can, like, this has been an incredibly tough event for us, for our local community, and for people Australia-wide. We're seeing ongoing extreme flood events, and I think we can only hope that we learn from them. We use this as a driver for climate action. We can, like, I would hate to see people forget this and not do our best to really address climate change. And yeah, let's make this an opportunity. Like, something good has to come out of all of this.
Hear, Chloe. And there is such great opportunity for farmers and farming communities if we can get these policy settings right. There's huge benefits, as well as supporting our producers through these significant events. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Professor Brendan Mackey. Thank you, Kevin Hennessy and Chloe Fox, for being our guests today, and thank you for everyone's considered participation. The recording of this webinar will be available on Farmers for Climate Action's website for anyone who might have missed it. Thanks again, everyone. See you next time.